Barney Frank is here. For 30 years, he has represented Massachusetts in the House of Representatives. He is currently the ranking member on the House Financial Services Committee. In a survey of members of Congress, he was voted as being both the most partisan and the most bipartisan. He was at the center of the debate over financial regulatory reform last year. The Dodd-Frank bill was signed into law by President Obama in July. Since then, the legislation has faced challenges. The new majority in the House is attempting to water it down, while some Tea Party members want a complete overhaul. I'm very pleased to have Barney Frank back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie.
First of all, about Dodd-Frank, did you get most of what you thought ought to have been in that bill?
I didn't get everything I wanted. I got better than 90%. Actually, there was one thing in it that I didn't want, and it's now become the major focal point of controversy. That's the debate between the credit card companies and the retail merchants. Right. That's an important issue, but it's not a consumer protection issue, and it wasn't a cause of the crisis. So we did not have that in the House bill. As far as the House bill is concerned, yeah, we got most of what we wanted. I would not have exempted the automobile dealers from the Consumer Bureau. But here's the key point that people miss. The lobbying power, frankly, doesn't come from the big banks and their big money. The community banks, the smaller banks, beat the big banks. And people ought to understand this. It's a good thing about America. Money is important, but votes will beat money any day.
There is also this when people talk about Dodd-Frank. It is the notion that much of the regulations remain to be done and to be defined.
True.
And so the banks say, well, we're a little uncertain about how we feel about all this because we don't know how it's going to come down in the end. True?
Fair point.
And so therefore the power is in the people who define the enforcement.
Some of it is, although there were limits to what we do. For instance, we say if there is a failure, it's all too big to fail. From now on, if an institution fails, it goes out of business. We made it illegal now to do what was done in 2008. And I don't say that critically of Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, whom I admire, who were in charge at the time. They had no option. And one of the things we did, frankly, was to respond to Hank Paulson, Bush's Secretary of the Treasury's request that we give them some options. If a very large institution fails, here's the problem. It's got debts that it owes to so many different people, who in turn owe debts to so many different people, that the crash of one of those institutions can reverberate throughout the economy. Here's the dilemma. Do you pay their debts or do you not? Now, in 2008, the answer was either you pay all the debts or none of the debts. Legally, you had no choice, and you keep the institution going. We adopted, I have to say, Sarah Palin was a little bit right last year. For her, that's a pretty good batting average.
Death penalties.
We have death panels, but they're not for old ladies. Panels, right. We have death panels for big banks, not for old ladies. If a bank gets to the point where it can't meet its debts, first, that bank is put out of business. That bank is dissolved. The shareholders lose everything. The board of directors and the officers are fired. The federal government may then step in and pay some of the debts, not out of love for the bank, but because it is possible that the debts will spiral in that way. But if they do, and this goes back to what I said first, if the federal government has to step in and pay the debts, as it did, say, for AIG, and as it didn't do for Lehman Brothers, whatever the federal government pays out, and it's the minimum needed to avert disaster, will be recovered by an assessment on the large financial institutions, those that have more than $50 billion in assets. So we have specifically banned the notion that if a bank fails, it's going to be kept in business, pay off the debts.
Right. There also, all right. Look, as I noted, you're the ranking minority. Member of the Financial Services Committee, which. How does that feel, to be the main guy there at a time of a financial crisis, and now you are the ranking minority member of the committee?
To some extent, it's kind of, it means I don't work nearly as hard. I have to say my work is less satisfying.
Nor do you have as much power.
No, I don't have as much power. I don't have as much responsibility.
Exactly.
It's not as frustrating as you might think because we have completed the work. That's one reason why we were so eager to get this done last year. We didn't want to have it hang on. By the way, I forgot to answer. I skipped your very important question. The answer, and I do want to get back to it, Charlie, because it's central and you're right. Yes, we got a lot of power to the regulators. The reason, by the way, is twofold. First of all, things change. If we say that there needs to be a certain amount of, there needs to be more capital to offset what they do. We don't want them so leveraged. The more capital a bank has, the less likely it is to fail when it's made on loans. I don't know what that number is today, and I also know that whatever that number is today, that might not be the right number 5 years from now. So we left it to the regulators because we want to have flexibility. For people who think, and you didn't suggest this, but I know some have said, well, this could all be weakened by the regulators. But the fact is that with the Obama administration in place, You have regulators who help write the bill.
Yeah, but what they also say is that this Republican Congress in the Republican-controlled House will do things it hopes will lessen
I agree.
the power to enforce it.
But it'll be hard. They'll be hard pressed to do it. They won't be able to change things substantively because two reasons. First of all, the Senate won't go along and the President won't go along. Secondly, and there's a difference here between financial reform and health care and the environment. Where health care and the environment are concerned, the Republican Party is united. The very pure ideological free market conservatives and the Tea Party are together. But when it comes to financial reform, not so much.
Exactly.
The ideological free market conservatives believe that derivatives should be unregulated. The Tea Party's not that crazy about derivatives. There's a populist element there. They don't mind us regulating credit cards. They don't mind us doing some of this regulation. So they haven't yet tried to undo it altogether. But you're right.
The Tea Party people don't mind regulation, even though they don't like big government.
They don't like, well, people are not always consistent. Many of those who were most vehement against the health care bill argued that we better not do anything about Medicare.
No.
Which, I mean, or by the way, the most popular form of medical care in America with the recipients is totally government run. It's the medicine at the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Yeah,
that is totally government run, and they like it. But
well, it's the old notion about I don't like the government messing in my health care.
In my Medicare, yes.
With my Medicare.
What we have here is, so what the Republicans are doing is they are trying to reduce the funding that goes to the agencies to administer the bill. And it's particularly the case in derivatives, which are complicated and which were totally unregulated and led to a large part of the problem. AIG, which was the precipitating problem there, got into trouble over derivatives. They owed much more money than they could ever pay off because they had made bets that went bad. What we have is we gave much more power to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission to regulate derivatives. The Republicans in the House have refused to appropriate the money for them that they need to run this. So that's very much an issue. I hope that'll be overcome.
Now, the Volcker rules, so-called Volcker rules, are intact in this bill,
yes.
And therefore so-called investment banks will not be able to engage in proprietary trading.
Right. Here's the deal, and the argument for that.
Whatever
Paul
the definition
Volcker
of proprietary trading is.
Here's what Paul Volcker makes his point. We insure your deposits. If you are a bank, technically a bank, you take deposits, you get deposit insurance. The federal government is on the hook. If you gamble unwisely, the taxpayers, or that fund may have to bail you out. So we've said to a bank, you be a bank, if you're going to engage in some of this razzle-dazzle, put it somewhere else, put it in another institution. That's one, by the way, that the big banks disliked very strongly, and it went into the law over their objection.
And so what are they going to do? They're no longer going to engage in those kinds of businesses?
They will spin it off
like
and sell it
off.
off.
J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo,
they
and
will
all
have to either, they will either spin off the unit that does these kinds of things into a separate unit. And I have to say, from the standpoint of the American public and the economy, it really doesn't make any difference. It may cut the profits of some of these institutions. By the way, there's a very distinguished British leader named Adair Turner who was head of the Financial Services.
Right.
If we had stayed in power, and I continue to be chairman, I would be having hearings now about whether some of this financial activity does anybody any good or not.
Oh, yeah, he writes that.
I mean,
his quote is there any social good from the financial sector?
Look, the purpose of the financial sector is to be the intermediary.
Yeah.
We used to
allocate capital.
Right. Here's the deal. Theoretically, a lot of people have money in small amounts.
Right.
They go to a financial institution which aggregates it and then makes it available to people who are going to invest it to produce a good or a service. And they are the intermediaries. And we used to call it, when we lost money in the banking system, disintermediation.
Right.
I now believe that much of what goes on in some of these institutions that are complaining and that we restricted is trading for its own sake. When they go back and forth, let me give you an example. There's an article in the New York Times last week I would recommend to people. Hedge funds, potential gain from volatility. And what they said was the trouble in Japan, the trouble in the Middle East, which have got everybody all jumpy, that's not necessarily bad news for the hedge funds. Because the hedge fund doesn't just make money if the stocks become more valuable. It makes money on the difference between what they pay and what they can sell for.
Right.
And they arbitrage the differences. And yes, they do that. And most of it, in my judgment, has no particular social value.
Right. But there's nothing you can do about it?
Well, to the extent we didn't directly go after it. I would have been ready to have some hearings now. One, I would be willing to put some more revenue collection on them, like make hedge fund managers pay the regular income tax rate rather than get the capital gains tax for other people's money. But beyond that, when we do the Volcker Rule and some of these other things, and we say, well, the bank can't do these kinds of activities, and the financial institutions, oh, my God, maybe there'll be less of them. The answer is, okay, good.
Did you change anything about derivatives other than a kind of transparency?
Yes, and we made a distinction.
And a kind of a clearinghouse.
Well, that's beyond transparency. Derivatives have two functions. There is a legitimate function. If you are producing a good or a service, you want to be able to focus on your costs and your estimate of demand. You don't want to get blindsided by wild variations in your cost on something you can't control. Classic case, you're an airline. You want to figure out how people are likely to travel and where the demand's going to be. You don't want to be blindsided by an explosion in the Middle East that means all of a sudden your fuel prices triple or double or go up. So you hedge.
Right.
You buy fuel and you agree.
And financial institutions say that's an important function.
It's a very
to
important
lay off
function.
some of the risk.
It's a very important function. Basically what it is, you forego a windfall profit, you stave off a devastating loss. What we believe, though, what we said is, and if you are an end user, we call it, someone who is producing a good or service, and you are using derivatives for that purpose, the only thing we change is the price will be made public. And by the way, I'll give you my argument for that. Two insurance entities came in to see me and complained about this because they said, you're hurting the end users. And I thought they really were that we were hurting them. I said, well, the only thing we're doing is requiring the price to be public. And one of them, a younger man, said, yes, but that's a problem for us, Mr. Chairman, because if you make the price public, somebody else can come in ahead of us. I said, excuse me, does that mean that if we make the price you're charging people public, somebody else can come in and offer the product for a cheaper price? He said, exactly. And his older colleague said, Mr. Chairman, we're not pressing that argument. So
I want to go to this financial regulation, the Dodd-Frank bill. The controversial person is Elizabeth Warren. You have said, as recent as to this morning on television, that you think the president ought to put her name up.
Absolutely.
And appoint her to be the director of the Bureau.
Yes.
And that you believe she has a chance of being confirmed because on financial regulation, there is not a single monolithic point on terms of the Republican Party. Yes,
that's what I said. The Tea Party and the extreme free enterprise purists, except, by the way, I have to say, when I say free enterprise purists, apparently, except for agriculture, they're all for subsidized farming. Apparently, there's a footnote in all those books that says, maybe in German, and I couldn't read it, it says, except agriculture.
That's right.
But Elizabeth Warren is a very thoughtful, shrewd woman, and she believes very much in the market. Frankly, one of the problems I have, you talk about this with the derivatives. What we were doing derivatives, by and large, is to force more of them into a market-type operation rather than a one-on-one private negotiation. And I find some of my friends in the business community like competition as a spectator sport. They think it's wonderful to watch other people engage in it, but they often have reasons why competition, in their case, would be destructive. Elizabeth Warren believes in it. I'm proud of Dodd-Frank, and I'm proud particularly, she came to me a couple years ago with that idea. Right. And I'm very honored she did a video
to create the Bureau.
To create the independent Bureau. And here's the problem. Until we passed that bill, consumer protection was done as an afterthought by the control of the currency, who is the bank regulator.
And where was it? In the Federal Reserve is where it was?
It was spread out. Some of it was in the Federal Reserve. Some of it was in the control of the currency. Some of it was in the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
Yeah.
And some of it was nowhere, because we have things like payday lenders and check cashers where there was no federal involvement. Okay. So we said, no, we're going to make an agency whose main job is not to protect the banks, and as an afterthought do that. What I'm saying is that's more popular with the Tea Party wing than health care.
All right, but here's the criticism that they make. You may have a point, and it seems to me the president ought to have the political courage to go ahead and do it.
That's a nice word you use, courage.
You think it's right?
No, yes, there were other words people might have used. You were very
what would
genteel.
they use?
I'm not going to say.
Why doesn't he have the political courage to do that?
He may, and he did. Look, to his credit, he stood